Liza's legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the concrete floor of the storage unit, her pregnant belly making it impossible to catch herself gracefully. The metallic taste of fear flooded her mouth as she stared at the grotesque specimen bobbing gently in its glass prison. The heart looked disturbingly fresh, its chambers clearly defined through the crystal-clear preservation fluid. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, muscle memory driving her to call 911, but she stopped mid-dial. The coordinates etched into the metal plate beneath the jar, 42.331, 4 degree N, 83.0458 degree W, were burned into her memory from countless sleepless nights. Those numbers led to the abandoned lot where Marcus Thompson's belongings had been found scattered 3 years ago. Marcus, the 19-year-old who'd aged out of foster care and vanished without a trace. Marcus, whose case file still sat in her desk drawer because she'd never been able to let go. The refrigeration units hummed louder in the suffocating silence, their mechanical breathing the only sound besides her own ragged gasps. Dozens of identical wooden crates surrounded her, stacked like a macabre library of human remains. Each one bore the same medical supply company logo, Hartmann Biosolutions, and the same GPS coordinate format that made her stomach churn with recognition. She forced herself to stand, using the nearest crate for support, and immediately regretted it when she felt the cold vibration of the refrigeration unit through the wood. Her social work training kicked in, the same clinical detachment that had carried her through years of investigating child abuse and neglect cases. Document everything, look for patterns, find the truth, no matter how ugly. The second crate she opened contained a liver, its deep maroon surface unnaturally pristine. The coordinates led to Riverside Park, where Jenny Martinez had been last seen jogging 2 years ago. Jenny, whose mother still called Liza every month asking if there had been any updates, her voice growing smaller each time. A kidney in the third crate. Timothy Walsh, missing 18 months. A set of lungs in the fourth. Sarah Kim, vanished 6 months ago while walking home from her job at the diner. Every organ corresponded to someone she'd tried to find, someone whose disappearance had carved another piece out of her faith in the system she'd devoted her career to serving. The dates on the labels painted a horrifying timeline spanning over a decade, suggesting this wasn't some recent criminal enterprise, but an established operation that had been harvesting people like crops. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress, and Liza pressed both hands against her belly. She'd come here desperate for grocery money, maybe enough to buy a crib from Goodwill. Instead, she'd stumbled into a nightmare that made every missing person case she'd ever worked look like practice rounds for something much larger and more sinister. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Where are you? Rent's due tomorrow and Mrs. Patterson is asking about the deposit again." Rent. The deposit. Their landlord threatening eviction while David promised this was the last time, swearing he'd beaten his addiction even as their bank account bled dry from his one last hand at the casino. She'd believed him until she'd found the pawn shop receipts for her grandmother's wedding ring hidden in his jacket pocket this morning. The storage facility's owner would be back in an hour to collect payment and hand over the unit keys. She could walk away now, pretend she'd never opened these crates, never seen what was inside. Call in an anonymous tip and let someone else deal with the horror show she'd purchased with their last $300. But the coordinates wouldn't let her go. Each set of numbers represented someone's child, someone's sibling, someone's friend who had vanished into thin air while the police filed reports and social workers like her followed increasingly cold trails. How many families were still waiting for answers that were sitting right here in these refrigerated coffins? The August heat pressed against her back through the open storage unit door, creating a suffocating contrast with the artificially cooled air that kept the organs fresh. Sweat dripped down her spine as she pulled out her notebook and began copying down coordinates, organ types, and dates. If she was going to do this, if she was going to dive headfirst into whatever evil she'd accidentally purchased, she needed evidence. Her pen trembled as she wrote, the weight of her discovery settling into her bones like lead. Tomorrow she had a doctor's appointment at Detroit General Hospital, the same place where she'd planned to deliver her baby in 4 weeks. The same hospital whose logo she'd just noticed, stamped discreetly in the corner of several specimen labels. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Liza realized with crystal clarity that she was no longer just fighting for her family's financial survival. She was fighting to bring her child into a world where human beings weren't harvested like spare parts, where missing persons weren't reduced to GPS coordinates and medical specimens floating in glass jars. The storage unit's overhead light flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls of preserved horror surrounding her. The fluorescent light died with a sharp buzz, plunging Liza into darkness broken only by the dim blue glow from the refrigeration unit's LED displays. The mechanical humming seemed to grow louder in the blackness, like the breathing of some massive, sleeping beast. She fumbled for her phone's flashlight, her hands still trembling from adrenaline and the bone-deep cold that had nothing to do with the August heat pressing against her back. She needed to get out of here, process this, think. The drive home passed in a blur of stop-and-go traffic on I-75, her mind reeling between the coordinates in her notebook and the mundane reality of rush-hour commuters heading home to dinner and television. How could the world keep spinning normally when she'd just discovered evidence of systematic murder, when the missing persons cases that had haunted her dreams for years suddenly had answers, terrible, unthinkable answers? Her phone rang as she pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex, David's name flashing on the screen. She let it go to voicemail, not trusting herself to speak without her voice betraying the magnitude of what she'd found. The baby shifted restlessly in her womb, as if picking up on her distress through some primal connection. The elevator in their building had been broken for 3 weeks, forcing her to climb 4 flights of stairs that left her breathless and lightheaded. Their apartment door stood slightly ajar, yellow light spilling into the dim hallway along with the sound of David's voice talking rapidly to someone on the phone. I know, but she'll understand. This is different, Tommy. This is the real deal. I've got inside information on the Lions game this weekend, and with the spread they're offering—" His voice cut off abruptly as she pushed through the door. David sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by betting slips and crumpled energy drink cans, his laptop open to what she recognized as his online gambling account. The same account he'd promised to close 3 months ago when they'd had to choose between paying for groceries or keeping the electricity on. Liza, baby, I can explain. He started to rise, his hand moving instinctively to close the laptop, but she held up a palm to stop him. Don't. The word came out harder than she'd intended, carrying the weight of everything she'd just witnessed. Just don't. He looked younger when he was caught, his sandy hair disheveled from running his hands through it, his blue eyes wide with the particular desperation of an addict facing consequences. At 28, David still had the boyish charm that had attracted her 5 years ago when they'd met at a community center fundraiser. He'd been volunteering with at-risk kids then, patient and kind in a way that had made her believe they could build something beautiful together. Now she looked at him and saw a stranger wearing her husband's face, someone who would sell her grandmother's ring for one more chance at easy money while their baby grew inside her, completely dependent on 2 people who couldn't even keep their utilities turned on consistently. The storage unit thing didn't work out, she lied, because the truth was too massive, too dangerous to dump into their already fractured marriage. Nothing valuable. David's face crumpled with relief and disappointment in equal measure. That's okay. We'll figure something else out. I was just telling Tommy about this sure thing. There are no sure things. Liza moved past him to the refrigerator, its contents sparse enough that she could inventory them at a glance. 3 eggs, a half-empty gallon of milk that expired yesterday, a sleeve of lunch meat that smelled questionable. This is what we have to eat until I get paid Friday. This is our reality. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, David said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone she'd grown to hate. If I could just get ahead, just once, we could pay off the credit cards, get caught up on everything. We were caught up. The words tasted bitter. We had savings, we had a plan, we had... She stopped herself before she said hope, because admitting its absence felt too much like surrender. The baby kicked, a sharp jab against her ribs that made her gasp and press both hands to her belly. In 4 weeks, this child would emerge into a world where her father gambled away grocery money and her mother stumbled across evidence of systematic murder, where the hospital they'd chosen for the birth might be connected to the very network that had been harvesting human beings for over a decade. David was at her side instantly, his addiction forgotten in the face of his concern for their child. Is everything okay? Do we need to call Dr. Martinez? For a moment she saw the man she'd married again, protective, caring, present. The man who'd held her hair back during morning sickness and assembled the changing table 3 times because he'd misread the instructions. The man who talked to her belly every night, telling their daughter about all the places he'd take her, all the things he'd teach her. "We're fine," she whispered, though nothing felt fine anymore. "We're going to be fine." But even as she said it, she wondered if that was just another lie in a world that seemed suddenly built on nothing but lies and secrets and people who disappeared without a trace. David's phone rang, shattering the fragile moment between them. He glanced at the screen and his face went pale. "It's Tommy again. I should..." "Take it," Liza said, pulling away. She needed space to think, to process what she'd seen in that storage unit without David's desperation clouding her judgment. He stepped onto their narrow balcony, his voice dropping to urgent whispers. Through the sliding glass door, she could see his animated gestures, the way he paced in the small space like a caged animal. The same restless energy that had once seemed charming now looked pathetic against the backdrop of their dying houseplant and the neighbor's laundry hanging on the fire escape. Liza sank into the threadbare armchair they'd bought second-hand when they first moved in together, a notebook still clutched in her hands. The coordinates seemed to burn through the paper: 42.331, 4 degree N, 83.0458 degree W. Marcus Thompson's final resting place, reduced to numbers in a filing system. How many families would kill for this information? How many mothers like Mrs. Martinez, who called every month asking if there were any updates on their missing children? Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor at Child Protective Services. "Case review meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Need your files on the Thompson investigation." The timing felt like cosmic irony. Tomorrow she'd sit in a sterile conference room and discuss closing Marcus's case due to lack of evidence, while his heart sat preserved in a jar she'd bought for $300. The same $300 that represented their grocery money, their phone bill, their last desperate attempt to stay afloat. Through the balcony door, David's voice rose slightly. "Come on, man, you know I'm good for it. When have I ever let you down?" The question hung in the humid evening air like a bad joke. Liza opened her laptop and pulled up the National Missing Persons database, her fingers moving automatically to search for the coordinates from the second jar. The Riverside Park location where Jenny Martinez had vanished. The case details filled her screen: last seen jogging at 6:30 a.m. No signs of struggle, cell phone found in parking area with battery removed. She cross-referenced the date on the specimen label with Jenny's disappearance. Perfect match. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, then stopped. Who could she call? Detective Morrison, who'd laughed off her theory that the missing persons cases were connected, her supervisor, who'd already suggested she was too emotionally invested in cold cases, the FBI tip line where an anonymous report about organ trafficking would disappear into bureaucratic limbo. The baby kicked again, and Liza realized she'd been holding her breath. The movement felt different this time, urgent, insistent, as if her daughter was trying to tell her something. "Trust your instincts," she thought, remembering the words her mentor had used during her first week as a social worker. Children can't advocate for themselves. Someone has to speak for the voiceless. David slid the balcony door open, his face flushed with excitement. Liza, baby, you're not going to believe this. Tommy's got a friend who works at the casino, and there's this poker game tomorrow night. High stakes, but he says it's practically guaranteed money. She stared at him, wondering when the man she'd married had been replaced by this stranger who spoke of guaranteed money while their refrigerator sat empty. With what stakes, David? We have nothing left to bet. That's the beauty of it, he said, settling on the couch with the manic energy of someone who'd found religion. Tommy's willing to front me the buy-in. 5,000 gets us into a game where the average pot is 15 grand, even if I only win one hand. $5,000. The words came out flat, emotionless. You want to borrow $5,000 to gamble while our baby is due in 4 weeks? It's not gambling when you know you're going to win, David insisted, and the delusion in his voice made her stomach turn. This is our chance, Liza. Our one shot at getting back on our feet. The laptop screen still glowed with Jenny Martinez's case file, her smiling photo a stark reminder of what happened to young women who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time in Detroit. How many other Jennys were out there, walking home from work or jogging through parks, oblivious to the predators cataloguing their organs for future harvest? I need air, Liza said, closing the laptop and pushing herself out of the chair with effort. Her back ached, her feet were swollen, and the weight of her discovery pressed down on her like a physical force. Where are you going? David called after her as she headed for the door. We need to talk about this opportunity. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, looking back at him surrounded by betting slips and energy drinks, his eyes bright with the fever of addiction. 24 hours ago, his gambling had been their biggest problem. Now it felt like a minor inconvenience compared to the horror she'd uncovered. I'm going for a walk, she said. I need to think. What she didn't say was that she was walking toward the hardest decision of her life. The August heat hit her like a wall the moment she stepped outside, but Liza welcomed it after the artificial chill that had seeped into her bones at the storage facility. The parking lot shimmered with heat waves, and somewhere in the distance a siren wailed, just another evening soundtrack in Detroit. She walked without direction, her swollen feet protesting with each step on the cracked sidewalk. The notebook felt heavy in her back pocket, weighted with coordinates that could change everything or destroy her family completely. Around her, the neighborhood hummed with ordinary life. Kids playing basketball in a driveway, someone grilling burgers, a couple arguing through an open window about whose turn it was to take out the trash. Normal problems, normal lives. Her phone buzzed again, another call from David, but she silenced it without looking. She needed silence to think, space to breathe, distance from his desperate schemes and manic energy. How had she not seen how far he'd fallen? Or maybe the real question was when she'd stopped believing he could climb back out. The baby shifted restlessly, pressing against her bladder, and Liza found herself at the entrance to Riverside Park, the same park where Jenny Martinez had been jogging 2 years ago when she vanished without a trace, where someone had carefully removed the battery from her cell phone before leaving it in the parking area, making it impossible to track her movements. Now Liza knew why. Jenny hadn't been random prey. She'd been selected, harvested, reduced to coordinates and medical specimens. The thought made bile rise in her throat. She lowered herself onto a bench near the jogging path, watching late-evening runners pass by in their bright athletic wear, earbuds in, completely unaware they might be shopping themselves to predators. How many of them would make it home tonight? How many would become the next set of coordinates in someone's filing system? The weight of knowledge felt crushing. Every missing persons case she'd worked suddenly had new implications. Marcus Thompson, who'd been walking home from his job at the auto parts store. Sarah Kim, heading home from the late shift at the diner. Timothy Walsh, last seen leaving his community college night class. All of them young, healthy, the perfect demographic for organ harvesting. Her supervisor's words echoed in her memory. You can't save everyone, Liza. Sometimes people just disappear, and we have to accept that we may never have answers. But she had answers now. Terrible, impossible answers that came with an equally impossible choice. If she went to the police, what then? Even if they believed her, and Detective Morrison's track record suggested he wouldn't, any investigation would take months. The people involved would have time to disappear the evidence, relocate their operation, maybe eliminate loose ends like storage facility workers who might remember a pregnant woman asking too many questions. And David. God, David with his gambling debts and his desperate need for quick money. What would happen to him if word got out that his wife had discovered something this big? Tommy and his casino connections suddenly seemed a lot more sinister when viewed through the lens of organized crime. Her phone rang again, and this time she saw it was Dr. Martinez calling. Her obstetrician, the woman who'd guided her through 9 months of pregnancy, who'd assured her that Detroit General was one of the safest places in the city to deliver a baby. "Hello, Dr. Martinez." "Liza, I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted to personally remind you about tomorrow's appointment. We'll be doing your final ultrasound and going over the birth plan. Are you still planning to deliver at Detroit General?" The question hit like a physical blow. Detroit General, where she'd seen the logo stamped on specimen labels, where her child was supposed to take her first breath in just 4 weeks. Yes, I think so. You sound uncertain. Is everything all right? Any concerns about the facility?" Liza stared across the park at the jogging path where Jenny Martinez had taken her last steps as a free woman. "Dr. Martinez, how well do you know the other doctors at Detroit General? The surgical staff?" A pause. "That's an odd question, Liza. Is there something specific you're worried about?" "Everything," she wanted to say. "I'm worried about everything because I've stumbled onto something that makes me question whether anywhere is safe anymore. Just nervous about delivery," she said instead. "First-time mother jitters. That's completely normal. We'll discuss all your options tomorrow, all right? Try to get some rest." But rest felt impossible when her notebook contained evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the very hospital where she'd planned to become a mother. When her husband was probably making calls to borrow money they'd never be able to repay. When the right thing to do might destroy everything she had left. She walked home as the streetlights began to flicker on, each step heavier than the last, carrying the weight of too much knowledge and too few good choices. The apartment building loomed ahead like a prison she'd voluntarily sentenced herself to, its broken elevator and peeling paint suddenly symbolic of every compromise she'd made to get to this point. Liza paused on the front steps, her hand instinctively moving to her belly where the baby had gone still, as if sensing the gravity of the moment approaching. Through the 4th-floor window, she could see David silhouetted against the yellow light, still pacing, still talking on the phone, still chasing the impossible dream that the next bet would fix everything. The sight that had once filled her with sympathy now sparked something harder, more crystalline in its clarity. She wasn't going back to that apartment. Not tonight. Not to watch her husband mortgage their future on another sure thing, while specimen jars labeled with Detroit General's logo sat in a storage unit across town, waiting for someone to make the choice between comfort and conscience. Instead, she turned and walked back toward her car, her movements deliberate despite the awkwardness of her pregnant body. The baby stirred, perhaps sensing the shift in her mother's resolve, and Liza pressed her hand to the spot where a tiny foot pushed against her ribs. "We're going to do the right thing," she whispered to her daughter, "even if it scares us, especially if it scares us." The drive back to the storage facility felt like crossing into enemy territory. The industrial district had transformed in the darkness, shadows stretching between buildings like fingers reaching for secrets. Security lights cast harsh circles on empty pavement, and the humid air seemed to pulse with danger she hadn't noticed in daylight. Unit 247 stood waiting like a confession booth, its metal door hiding truths that could unravel lives or save them. Liza's hands shook as she entered the code, but the trembling stopped once the door rolled up, revealing the neat rows of wooden boxes that had haunted her thoughts for hours. She pulled out her phone and opened the camera app, her thumb hovering over the record button. Once she started documenting, there would be no pretending she'd never found this place. No going back to her ordinary life of unpaid bills and a husband who confused hope with delusion. The first photo captured the overall layout, dozens of identical wooden boxes arranged with military precision. The second focused on the specimen labels, the clinical handwriting that reduced human lives to catalog numbers. The third showed the Detroit General logo stamped in blue ink across multiple containers. With each image, she felt herself stepping further across an invisible threshold, leaving behind the woman who'd attended storage auctions looking for quick cash and becoming someone else entirely. Someone who'd seen too much to stay silent. Someone who understood that knowledge came with responsibility, regardless of personal cost. She photographed the coordinates, the dates, the specimen types listed in neat columns. Her phone's flash illuminated details that made her stomach lurch. Surgical notes, preservation methods, transport schedules. The scope of the operation was staggering, spanning years and multiple states, involving a network of people who'd turned human trafficking into a medical supply chain. When she reached Jenny Martinez's container, she paused. The young woman's heart floated in its preservation fluid like an accusation. Still perfect, still viable, still waiting for justice that might never come. Unless someone spoke for her. Unless someone chose to cross the threshold from witness to advocate. "I'm sorry this happened to you," Liza whispered to the jar. "I'm sorry no one looked hard enough to find you." She photographed everything, her phone's memory filling with evidence that could topple the network or get her killed trying. The baby kicked sharply as if protesting the danger, but Liza found herself oddly calm. For the first time in months, she knew exactly what she was doing and why it mattered. When she documented every box, every label, every piece of damning evidence, she stepped back and surveyed the storage unit one final time. Tomorrow, this would all be in the hands of authorities who might or might not believe her. Tonight, it was hers alone. The weight of truth and the burden of choice. She pulled out her notebook and began writing contact information for every law enforcement agency she could think of. FBI, State Police, Detroit PD, the medical examiner's office. If one wouldn't listen, maybe another would if they tried to silence her. At least the evidence would exist in multiple places. Her phone buzzed with another call from David, and this time she answered. "Liza, thank God, where are you? Tommy's waiting for an answer about tomorrow night." "David," she interrupted, her voice steady in a way that surprised them both. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm about to do something that's going to change everything for us. Our marriage, our future, our safety. And I need to know, when it matters, when it really counts, are you going to choose us or the addiction?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of a question that had been building for months. Finally, he spoke. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" Liza looked once more at the storage unit that had become her point of no return. "I found something," she said, "and there's no going back. David, I need you to come to me, right now." Liza kept her voice level, authoritative in a way that seemed to cut through his manic energy. "Bring your laptop and meet me at the Coney Island on 8 Mile, the one by the old GM plant." "Liza, what the hell is going on? You're scaring me." "Good," she said, surprising herself with the hardness in her tone. "You should be scared. We both should be. Just come. Don't tell anyone where you're going." She ended the call before he could argue and drove through empty streets toward the diner, her mind racing faster than her Honda's struggling engine. The late-night crowd at Stavros Coney Island consisted of shift workers, insomniacs, and people with nowhere else to go, exactly the kind of place where a pregnant woman and her desperate husband could disappear into the background noise of other people's problems. David arrived 20 minutes later, laptop bag slung over his shoulder, his face pale with confusion and withdrawal anxiety. He slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from her, his eyes darting around the fluorescent-lit space like a cornered animal's. "Liza, you look different," she finished. "I know. Everything's different now." She slid her phone across the table, the photo gallery open to the first image of the storage unit. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a sick understanding that made him push the phone away. Jesus Christ, what is this? It's what I bought today, with our last $300. Her voice carried no accusation, just flat statement of fact. Those are human organs, David. Hearts, livers, kidneys, all labeled with Detroit General's logo, all corresponding to missing persons cases I've worked on. David stared at her as if she'd started speaking a foreign language. That's impossible. Storage auctions people don't just keep looking at the photos. He scrolled through the images, his face growing paler with each one. When he reached Jenny Martinez's container, he set the phone down with shaking hands and ran to the bathroom. Liza heard him retching through the thin walls. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with silver roots showing through black hair, refilled Liza's coffee without comment. This was Detroit. She'd seen worse than a pregnant woman making her husband sick with cell phone pictures. David returned 5 minutes later, his face grey and sweaty. This can't be real. It's real, and it gets worse. Liza pulled up the notes she'd taken, the careful documentation of dates and coordinates. The timeline goes back 15 years, dozens of victims. And look at this. She showed him the surgical notes, the transport schedules, the careful inventory management. This isn't some random psychopath. This is organized, professional, ongoing. We have to call the police. Do we? The question hung between them like a blade. Think about it, David. Really think. Who's involved in something this big? Who has access to surgical facilities, preservation equipment, transport networks? Who benefits from a steady supply of fresh organs? Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by terror. The hospital, where I'm supposed to give birth in 4 weeks, she confirmed. Where Dr. Martinez has been monitoring our baby's development, where they have all my medical records, know exactly when I'll be most vulnerable. David reached across the table and grabbed her hands, his grip desperate. We leave, tonight. We pack up and drive somewhere else, somewhere safe. There is nowhere safe. The words came out harder than she'd intended. And there are people depending on us to do the right thing. Families who've spent years wondering what happened to their children. Parents like Jenny Martinez's mother, who still calls the police every month asking for updates. I don't care about other people right now, David said, his voice breaking. I care about you and our baby. I care about keeping you alive. Something shifted in Liza's chest, a recognition of the man she'd married beneath the layers of addiction and desperation. But it was too late for just caring. Then help me, she said. Help me figure out how to expose this without getting us killed. Because doing nothing isn't an option anymore. I know too much, and they're going to realize someone was in that storage unit eventually. David stared at the phone again, then at his wife's face, seeing perhaps for the first time the steel that had always been there beneath her gentleness. What do you need me to do? I need you to choose, Liza said quietly. Us or the gambling, sobriety or whatever Tommy's offering. Because where we're going, I need you clear-headed and present. I need the man I married, not the addict who's been living in his skin. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as David wrestled with the hardest decision of his life, while 20 miles away, a storage unit full of stolen hearts waited in the darkness. David's hands trembled as he pushed the phone away, unable to look at the images anymore. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, broken only by the distant clatter of dishes from the diner's kitchen and the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I choose us. He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed but clearer than she'd seen them in months. I choose you and the baby. I choose sobriety. The word came out like a confession. But Liza, I'm scared. Not just of this organ thing. I'm scared I don't know how to be the man you need anymore. Something loosened in her chest, a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Then we figure it out together. But first, we need a plan that doesn't get us killed. David opened his laptop, his fingers still shaking as he booted it up. What are you thinking? Insurance, Liza said, pulling out her notebook. We create a dead man's switch. Multiple copies of everything sent to different agencies, set to release automatically if anything happens to us. FBI, state police, medical examiners, journalists. Make ourselves too dangerous to silence. As David worked on setting up delayed email accounts, Liza studied the diner around them. 3 truck drivers hunched over coffee at the counter. A woman about her own age stared out the window while her toddler slept in a high chair. The waitress moved between tables with practiced efficiency, probably working a double shift to make ends meet. All of them living ordinary lives, unaware that predators moved among them wearing surgical scrubs and hospital badges. "Done," David said, closing the laptop. 24 emails scheduled to send in 72 hours unless we log in to cancel them. Photos, documents, everything. He paused, studying her face. "What happens now?" "Now we go home and pretend nothing's changed while we figure out our next move." "And David?" She reached across the table and gripped his wrist. "Tommy calls, you don't answer. The casino calls, you hang up. Whatever they offered you tonight, it's off the table permanently." He nodded, but she could see the withdrawal anxiety building behind his eyes, the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his fingers drummed against the table. Going cold turkey from gambling addiction while planning to expose a murder conspiracy wasn't exactly ideal timing, but she'd learned that timing was a luxury they couldn't afford. The drive home felt different than it had hours earlier. The same streets, same broken streetlights, same urban decay, but now every shadow could hide surveillance. Every parked car could contain watchers. Liza found herself checking the rearview mirror obsessively, looking for patterns in the traffic behind them. Their apartment building looked exactly as they'd left it, but when they reached the 4th floor, David stopped short of their door. "There," he whispered, pointing to a thin piece of tape he'd placed across the doorframe that morning, an old habit from his paranoid gambling days. "It's been moved." Liza's blood turned cold. Someone had been inside their home while they were gone. "What do we do?" "We go in like normal," David said, his voice steadier than she'd heard it in weeks. "But we don't touch anything we don't have to, and we don't sleep here tonight." The apartment looked undisturbed at first glance, but David's trained eye caught the subtle signs of intrusion. A book shifted slightly on the shelf. The coffee table moved an inch to the left. Her prenatal vitamins turned so the label faced a different direction. Professional work, meant to be undetectable to anyone not specifically looking for it. "They were looking for something," David murmured, as they gathered essential items. Clothes, toiletries, Liza's medical records. Or placing something. Listening devices, maybe. Liza's laptop was exactly where she'd left it. But when she touched the mouse, the screen showed recent activity she didn't recognize. Someone had accessed her work files, her email, her browser history. They knew about every missing person case she'd worked on, every family she'd counseled, every connection she might make to their operation. "They know," she said, her voice barely audible. "They know I figured it out." David appeared in the doorway with a hastily packed duffel bag, his face grim. "Then we're out of time for subtlety. Whatever we're going to do, it has to be tomorrow." As they prepared to leave the apartment that had been their home for 3 years, Liza felt the weight of transformation settling over her like armor. The woman who'd attended a storage auction looking for quick cash was gone, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous, more desperate, someone who understood that survival meant becoming something she'd never planned to be. The baby kicked against her ribs as if sensing the change, and Liza pressed her hand to the spot, making a silent promise. They would survive this, all 3 of them, whatever it took. Behind them, their ransacked apartment waited in darkness, while somewhere across the city, people in surgical masks prepared for another harvest. The ordeal begins. They checked into a motel on the outskirts of Dearborn, the kind of place that asked no questions and accepted cash without requiring identification. The room smelled of industrial disinfectant and cigarettes, its thin walls offering little comfort but enough anonymity to let them think. David sat on the edge of the sagging bed, laptop balanced on his knees, while Liza paced the narrow space between the door and the window, her hand pressed protectively over her belly. "The emails go out in 68 hours, David said, his voice tight with concentration. "But that assumes we're alive to not stop them." "We will be." Liza's words carried more conviction than she felt. The baby had been restless since they'd left the apartment, turning and kicking as if responding to her elevated heart rate. "What about your contact at the FBI field office, the one who helped with that trafficking case last year?" "Agent Morrison, I can try, but—" David's phone buzzed against the nightstand. Tommy's name flashed on the screen. They both stared at it until it went to voicemail, then immediately started ringing again. "He's persistent tonight," Liza observed. David powered off the phone without looking at it, probably wondering why I didn't show up to lose money I don't have. But his hands shook as he set it aside, and she could see the familiar hunger building behind his eyes, not for gambling now, but for the chemical rush of risk, the temporary escape from crushing reality. "David." Her voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. "Look at me." When he met her eyes, she saw the man she'd fallen in love with 5 years ago struggling against the addict who'd been slowly consuming him. The moment balanced on a knife's edge between recovery and relapse, between facing their nightmare together or her facing it alone. "I need you here," she said quietly. "Not lost in your head, not planning your next bet, not counting cards or calculating odds. Here. With me. Present." He nodded, but she could see the effort it cost him. Withdrawal from gambling addiction was a psychological battlefield, and stress made every symptom worse. His foot tapped constantly against the carpet, and he kept reaching for his phone before stopping himself. "Tell me about the hospital," he said, forcing his attention back to their crisis. "Who else has access to your records?" The question she'd been dreading. Liza sank into the room's single chair, feeling the weight of betrayal settling over her like a lead blanket. "Dr. Martinez has been my OB since the beginning. She knows everything, my due date, my blood type, the baby's development, even our financial situation. She's the one who recommended I start taking extra iron supplements last month." "Iron supplements?" David's head snapped up. "Why?" "She said my hemoglobin was slightly low, common in pregnancy." But even as she said it, pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Extra iron improves blood quality, makes organs more viable for transplant. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside their window, traffic hummed along the highway, people going about their normal lives while hers crumbled into nightmare. A semi-truck's air brakes hissed in the parking lot, and somewhere a door slammed, making them both jump. "They've been preparing you," David said, his voice hollow. "Your baby." "No." The word exploded from her with such force that David flinched. "No, that's not. They can't." But her protests dissolved as the full horror crystallized. A healthy newborn's organs were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars on the black market. A mother dying in childbirth was an unfortunate but explainable tragedy. Her phone rang, Dr. Martinez's number appearing on the screen like an accusation. Liza stared at it, paralyzed, until David reached over and declined the call. "We leave," he said urgently. "Tonight. We drive to another state, find a different hospital." "And what? Give birth without any medical records?" "They'll ask questions, run blood work. And if this network extends beyond Detroit—" She pressed her palms against her temples, trying to think through the panic flooding her system. "Besides, running makes us look guilty, like we're involved somehow. Then what do you want to do?" Before she could answer, the motel room's landline rang. They stared at it in horror. Nobody knew they were here. Nobody should be able to find them. The ringing continued, shrill and insistent, until David finally picked up. "Hello?" His voice was carefully neutral. Liza watched his face drain of color as he listened to whatever voice spoke on the other end. When he hung up, his hands were shaking again, but not from withdrawal this time. "Wrong number," he said, but his eyes told a different story. Someone asking for directions to Detroit General. The message was clear. They were being watched. Their location was known. and their 72-hour countdown had just become meaningless because the predators had decided not to wait. The phone's dial tone buzzed in the silence like a death knell. David set the receiver down with exaggerated care, as if sudden movements might shatter what little safety they had left. Liza felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, a sharp reminder of what she stood to lose. "We need to move," she whispered, already reaching for their hastily packed bag. "Now." But David was staring at the window, his face pale in the neon glow from the motel's vacancy sign. "Too late," he said quietly. "Black sedan, parking lot entrance. 2 men inside, and they're not here for the continental breakfast." Liza's blood turned to ice. She moved to the edge of the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. The sedan sat motionless under a broken streetlight, its occupants barely visible silhouettes. Professional, patient, predatory. "The bathroom window," David said, moving toward their bag. "It faces the back alley." "I'm 7 months pregnant," Liza hissed. "I can barely fit through a normal door, let alone squeeze through a bathroom window." Panic clawed at her throat as she watched the sedan's doors open. 2 figures emerged, moving with the casual confidence of men who knew their prey was trapped. David's laptop chimed with an incoming message. They both froze as he opened it, his face illuminating in the blue glow of the screen. The email was simple, containing only a photo and a single line of text. The photo showed their apartment building, their specific window. The timestamp was from 20 minutes ago. The message read, "Cancel the emails, delete everything, walk away, last warning." "They hacked our system," David breathed. "They know about the dead man's switch." A sharp knock echoed through the room, 3 deliberate raps that somehow conveyed more menace than a battering ram. Liza's hand flew to her belly as the baby seemed to somersault in response to her spiking adrenaline. "Mrs. Hartwell?" The voice was cultured, professional, the kind of voice that belonged in a boardroom or surgical suite. "We'd like to have a conversation." David moved protectively in front of Liza, but she could see the helplessness in his posture. His laptop skills and her social work training were useless against whatever waited on the other side of that door. "We have nothing to say," Liza called out, proud that her voice remained steady. "I think you'll find that you do." A pause, then the sound of an electronic keycard being swiped. The door lock disengaged with a soft click. The motel manager was very cooperative once we explained the situation, something about unpaid debts and immigration status. The door swung open slowly, revealing a tall man in an expensive suit and a shorter, broader companion whose jacket bulged tellingly at the shoulder. The tall man's face was kind, grandfatherly, exactly the sort of person you'd trust with your life in an emergency room. "Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell," he said, stepping into the room without invitation. "And David, please sit. We have much to discuss. We're not—" David started. "Sitting," the tall man completed. "Yes, I can see that. Allow me to introduce myself. Dr. Richard Vance, Chief of Surgery at Detroit General. I believe you've stumbled upon some materials that belong to us." Liza's knees buckled, not from fear, though terror coursed through her veins, but from the crushing weight of realization. The Chief of Surgery. The man who'd shaken her hand at hospital fundraisers, who'd personally assured her that Detroit General provided the finest obstetric care in the region. The storage unit was legally purchased, she managed. "Legally, yes. Wisely." Dr. Vance smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "That remains to be seen. You see, Mrs. Hartwell, you've put us in a rather difficult position. Those materials represent years of careful work, countless lives saved through organ donation. The paperwork irregularities you may have noticed are simply bureaucratic shortcuts to ensure that viable organs reach patients who need them." "Bureaucratic shortcuts?" The words exploded from Liza with such fury that both men took a step back. "Those are murder victims, people I've worked with, families I've counseled. Families you'll never counsel again if you don't make the right choice tonight." Dr. Vance's mask of kindness finally slipped, revealing something cold and surgical beneath. Delete the emails, Mrs. Hartwell. Forget what you've seen. Focus on your pregnancy, your upcoming delivery. We're prepared to ensure your birthing experience is comfortable. The threat hung in the air like a scalpel. Liza felt David's hand find hers, his palm slick with sweat as the baby kicked frantically against her ribs. 72 hours had become 72 seconds, and all her careful planning crumbled like sand. "What guarantee do we have?" David asked, his voice cracking. Dr. Vance smiled again, and this time it was genuine, the smile of a man who'd already won. "Mr. Hartwell, in my experience, the only guarantee in life is that everyone dies eventually. The only variable is timing." Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, but they were heading away from the motel, away from help, away from hope. The sirens faded into the Detroit night, taking with them any illusion that rescue might come. Liza stared at Dr. Vance's predatory smile, and in that moment of crystalline terror, something fundamental shifted inside her. The pieces she'd been frantically trying to assemble suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "You made a mistake," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the motel room's stifling tension. Dr. Vance raised an eyebrow, his expression amused. "Oh? And what might that be?" "You assumed I was just another desperate pregnant woman who stumbled into something too big for her." Liza stepped forward, ignoring David's restraining hand on her arm. "But I'm not just pregnant. I'm a social worker specializing in missing persons. I know these cases better than anyone." The amusement flickered in Dr. Vance's eyes. His companion shifted uncomfortably, hand moving closer to his jacket. "The GPS coordinates in those boxes," Liza continued, her mind racing as connections formed like synapses firing. "They don't just mark dump sites, they mark hunting grounds, specific locations where your network targeted victims." She felt the baby kick, but instead of panic, it filled her with fierce determination. "The dates aren't harvest dates, they're kill dates. And the victims weren't random. Mrs. Hartwell, Jenny Calderon, disappeared from the Corktown shelter on March 15th, pregnant. Due date April 20th. Liza's voice grew stronger with each revelation. Marcus Webb, homeless veteran, AB-negative blood type, universal plasma donor. Last seen at Detroit General's emergency room. Dr. Vance's composure cracked slightly. "You're overwrought. Pregnancy hormones." Sarah Kim, 23-year-old nursing student, healthy kidneys, perfect match for someone on your transplant list. Liza stepped closer, fury burning away her fear. "But here's what you didn't count on. I don't just know the missing persons statistics. I know the organ donation statistics too." David stared at her in amazement as she transformed before his eyes from cornered victim to avenging fury. "Detroit General's organ procurement rate increased by 300% over the past 3 years, she continued. "Your surgical success rates are impossibly high, and your hospital just happened to receive a massive federal grant for a new transplant wing." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You're not just harvesting organs, you're farming people." The silence stretched taut as Dr. Vance studied her with new respect and considerably more caution. "Even if that were true," he said finally, "it changes nothing about your situation, doesn't it?" Liza pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over the screen. "Because while you were tracking our emails and hacking our dead man's switch, you missed something crucial. I uploaded everything to the National Missing Persons database an hour before we ever left our apartment, with my federal access codes." Dr. Vance went very still. "That's impossible." "Is it? I've been filing missing persons reports for 5 years. The system knows my access patterns, trusts my submissions. By morning, every law enforcement agency in the Midwest will have copies of your organ inventory cross-referenced with open cases." She smiled, and for the first time since entering that storage unit, felt the rush of having the upper hand. "You see, Doctor, I may not be a surgeon, but I know how to document evidence, and I know how to ensure it can't be disappeared." The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if celebrating. Liza pressed her hand to the spot, feeling the life moving inside her. Life that would never end up catalogued in a wooden box. "But here's the part you really didn't see coming," she said, her voice deadly calm. "I've been working missing persons cases for 5 years. I know how predators think. I know how they operate." She stepped closer to Dr. Vance, close enough to see sweat beading on his forehead. "And I know that someone with your surgical skills didn't learn them harvesting homeless people and drug dealers." Dr. Vance's face had gone ashen. "You've been practicing, perfecting your techniques. Which means there are other storage units, aren't there? Other locations where you keep your practice runs." Liza felt adrenaline surging through her system, sharper and more focused than any panic. Medical students who disappeared during residency rotations, patients who died on the table from complications. How many, doctor? How many before you felt confident enough to start targeting people like me? The room had gone deadly quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioning unit and David's rapid breathing. Dr. Vance's companion was looking increasingly uncomfortable, his hand now resting openly on his weapon. "You can kill us," Liza said quietly, "but you can't kill what's already in the system, and you can't stop what's coming." She smiled again, feeling power flow through her like electricity. "The only question now is whether you run, or whether you're still here when the FBI arrives." Outside, new sirens began wailing in the distance, but this time they were getting closer. The sirens grew louder, their wail cutting through the night air like salvation itself. Dr. Vance's companion reached for his weapon, but the older man held up a restraining hand, his calculating eyes never leaving Liza's face. "You're bluffing," he said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Federal databases require supervisor approval for bulk uploads." "Do they?" Liza's smile widened. "Tell me, Doctor, how familiar are you with the Missing and Exploited Persons Information System? Because I've been using it longer than most FBI agents." She watched his confident mask continue to crumble. "My supervisor gave me emergency authorization codes after the Riverside trafficking case. Sometimes missing persons can't wait for bureaucracy." The sirens were definitely getting closer now. Through the thin motel walls, she could hear car doors slamming in the parking lot, voices calling out in crisp, professional tones that made Dr. Vance's companion take a nervous step toward the window. "Boss," the man muttered, "we need to go. Now." But Dr. Vance stood frozen, a surgeon who'd just realized his patient was beyond saving. The federal database upload wasn't the only card Liza had played, it was merely the one that bought them time. The real revelation was just beginning to sink in. She hadn't been randomly desperate when she'd bought that storage unit. She'd been systematically hunting. "You want to know what else I figured out while you were threatening my family?" Liza moved to David's laptop, her fingers dancing across the keys with practiced efficiency. "I've been tracking organ procurement patterns for 8 months. Ever since I started noticing that missing persons in my caseload had very specific medical profiles." The screen filled with spreadsheets, charts, maps, months of careful documentation that had led her to that storage auction, like a bloodhound following a scent. AB-negative blood types, rare tissue matches, perfect kidney function. Her voice grew stronger with each revelation. "You weren't covering your tracks very well, Doctor. You were just counting on nobody caring enough about homeless people and addicts to connect the dots." David stared at her in amazement. "Liza, you never told me." "Because I wasn't sure. Because I hoped I was wrong." She turned back to Dr. Vance, who now looked like a man watching his empire crumble in real time. "But when I saw that storage auction listing, abandoned unit belonging to Marcus Torres, convicted on drug charges, I knew. Drug dealers don't usually have medical-grade preservation equipment." The sirens had stopped just outside. Red and blue lights strobed through the window curtains, painting the motel room in alternating waves of authority and menace. Dr. Vance's companion was openly panicking now, his hand shaking as he drew his weapon. "Easy," Dr. Vance said, his surgical calm finally reasserting itself. "Mrs. Hartwell, you've been very clever. But cleverness and survival are different things entirely. Are they? Liza didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the gun pointed directly at her swollen belly. Because I've spent 5 years learning how to survive in a system that treats people like statistics, how to document everything, back up everything, share everything. Her hand rested protectively over the baby, who had gone still as if sensing the danger. The federal upload was just the beginning. A sharp knock echoed through the room, not the casual rap of Dr. Vance's earlier arrival, but the authoritative boom of law enforcement. FBI, open the door. David exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging with relief, but Liza kept her eyes locked on Dr. Vance. The surgeon's face had transformed into something cold and calculating, a man rapidly weighing his options. "You have approximately 30 seconds before they breach that door," she said quietly. "The question is whether you want to be found standing over 2 dead bodies or whether you want to disappear into the night and try to salvage what's left of your network." "Boss," the companion hissed, "we can take them out and go through the bathroom." "Shut up!" Dr. Vance's voice cut like a scalpel. He studied Liza for a long moment, professional respect mixing with something that might have been admiration. "You played this very well, Mrs. Hartwell." "Very well indeed." The pounding on the door intensified. "This is Agent Morrison, FBI. We have the building surrounded." Morrison, David's contact from the trafficking case. Liza felt the last piece of her desperate plans slide into place. She'd gambled everything on Morrison remembering David, on federal protocols she'd learned during interagency cooperation seminars, on the slim hope that her credentials would buy them just enough credibility to survive the night. Dr. Vance stepped back from the window, his companion reluctantly lowering the weapon. "This isn't over," he said simply. "Yes," Liza replied, feeling the baby kick once more, stronger now, like a victory celebration it is. The door exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood and federal authority, but for the first time in days, Liza felt truly safe. The doorframe erupted in splinters as Agent Morrison burst through, weapon drawn, his tactical team spreading through the room like a controlled flood. Liza felt her knees buckle as adrenaline finally gave way to exhaustion, David's arms catching her before she could hit the floor. "Federal agents, hands where we can see them." Dr. Vance raised his hands with surgical precision, his face a mask of professional composure, even as his world collapsed around him. His companion, however, made the mistake of reaching for his weapon one final time. The tactical team's response was immediate and overwhelming. Within seconds, the man was face down on the stained motel carpet, zip-tied and reading his rights from a card that Agent Morrison produced with practiced efficiency. "Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell?" Morrison approached slowly, holstering his weapon as his team secured the scene. "Ma'am, are you injured?" "No," Liza managed, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. "We're okay. The baby's okay." But even as she said it, she wondered if that was true. The past 72 hours had changed something fundamental inside her, carved away the naive social worker who'd believed the system could protect people and replaced her with someone harder, more calculating. Morrison's eyes moved to Dr. Vance, who stood perfectly still amid the chaos, watching the proceedings with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. "Dr. Richard Vance, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and violation of federal organ trafficking statutes." "I'll require my attorney," Dr. Vance said simply. Then his gaze found Liza across the room, and she saw something that made her blood freeze. Not defeat, but the cold satisfaction of a chess player who'd already planned his next 10 moves. "Mrs. Hartwell, I do hope you understand what you've set in motion. The organ procurement network you've discovered serves very important people, people who don't appreciate disruption to their medical care." Agent Morrison stepped between them, but Dr. Vance's words had already found their target. Even as the agents led him away in handcuffs, Liza felt the weight of his warning settling over her like a shroud. She'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. "Ma'am?" Morrison turned back to her, his expression concerned. "We're going to need comprehensive statements from both of you. Everything you discovered, everyone you've been in contact with. This investigation is going to be massive." David squeezed her hand. "Can we do it tomorrow? She needs rest, medical attention." "I'm fine," Liza interrupted, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "But Agent Morrison, you need to understand something. Dr. Vance isn't the head of this organization. He's middle management at best." She struggled to her feet, pushing away David's supporting hand. "The organ procurement records go back 15 years. The GPS coordinates span 6 states. This isn't just Detroit General, it's a network." Morrison nodded grimly. "We figured as much from your database uploads. The Bureau's already coordinating with field offices across the Midwest." He paused, studying her with new respect. "What you did tonight, Mrs. Hartwell, the documentation, the systematic approach, it's going to save lives, a lot of lives." But Liza wasn't feeling heroic. As the adrenaline faded, she was beginning to understand the full scope of what she'd unleashed. The storage unit had been one node in a vast web of corruption that reached into hospitals, morgues, law enforcement agencies. People with enough money and influence to make problems disappear. People who now considered her a problem. "Agent Morrison," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. How safe are we, really?" Morrison's pause was answer enough. "We'll arrange protection, of course. Safe house, new identities if necessary. For how long? 6 months? A year?" Liza felt the baby kick, a reminder of the life she was responsible for protecting. "You can't keep us hidden forever, and they can't let us live knowing what we know." The room had gone quiet except for the distant sound of more sirens, more law enforcement arriving to process what would become one of the largest organ trafficking investigations in federal history. Liza stared out the window at the flashing lights and realized with crystal clarity that her old life, the modest apartment, the social work job, the simple dream of raising her child in safety, was gone forever. "Ma'am," Morrison said gently, "we'll do everything in our power to protect you and your family. You have my word on that." Liza nodded, but she was already thinking ahead, planning contingencies, preparing for a future where trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. The naive woman who'd bought that storage unit 3 days ago would have believed Morrison's promise. But the woman standing in this motel room, surrounded by federal agents and the wreckage of her former innocence, knew better. The road back to safety would be longer and more dangerous than any of them imagined, and it was just beginning. Liza stared at the federal agents processing the crime scene and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the motel's overworked air conditioning. Morrison's promise of protection echoed hollow in her ears, a bureaucratic platitude that couldn't erase the calculating look in Dr. Vance's eyes as they'd led him away. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements, and knew with absolute certainty that hiding wasn't an option. "David," she said quietly, watching Morrison coordinate with his team through the shattered doorway, "we need to talk, alone." Her husband looked up from the laptop where he'd been reviewing their documentation, concern etching deeper lines around his eyes. The past 3 days had aged him, stripped away the comfortable assumptions of their middle-class life, and replaced them with a harder understanding of how the world really worked. They stepped onto the motel's narrow balcony, away from the federal agents cataloging evidence. The August heat hit them like a physical force, but Liza barely noticed. Her mind was racing, connecting patterns she'd been too exhausted to see clearly before. "They're going to offer us witness protection," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "New identities, relocation, the whole package. And we're going to turn it down." David stared at her. "Liza, what are you talking about? These people tried to kill us. They're still trying to kill us." "Exactly." She turned to face him fully, her hands gripping the rusted balcony railing. "Which means hiding makes us sitting ducks. Think about it. If this network is as vast as we know it is, how long before someone in witness protection develops a sudden need for federal resources? How long before our new identities accidentally get shared with the wrong people?" The parking lot below swarmed with federal vehicles, their flashing lights painting the cracked asphalt in strobing colors. But Liza wasn't watching the obvious law enforcement presence. She was studying the shadows, the darkened windows of surrounding buildings, the places where watchers might already be calculating their next move. "So what are you suggesting?" David's voice carried a note of dread, as if he already knew the answer wouldn't offer the safety they desperately needed. "We disappear on our own terms." Liza felt the baby kick, a sharp reminder of the innocent life depending on her decisions, but not to hide, to hunt. She'd been thinking about it since Dr. Vance's arrest, the pieces clicking together with the methodical precision she'd learned from 5 years of tracking missing persons. The storage unit hadn't been an endpoint. It had been a breadcrumb, one piece of evidence in a trail that stretched back years. "The GPS coordinates from those boxes," she continued, her mind working through the implications. "They don't just mark body dump sites. They mark operational territories. Each set of coordinates represents a different hunting ground, probably managed by different cells within the network." Her voice grew stronger as the plan crystallized. "If we can identify the pattern, predict their next targets." "Liza, you're 8 months pregnant." David's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "You can't seriously be considering taking on an organ trafficking conspiracy while carrying our child." But even as he spoke, she could see understanding dawning in his eyes, the same realization that had been building in her own mind since Morrison's inadequate promises of safety. There was no going back to their old life. The only path forward was through. "I've been tracking these disappearances for months without knowing what I was looking for," she said. "Now I know. And I have something they don't expect. Federal database access, interagency contacts, and a complete understanding of how missing persons investigations actually work." She paused, feeling the weight of what she was proposing. "We don't just run, David. We become the hunters instead of the hunted." Below them, Agent Morrison emerged from their motel room, his phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with what sounded like field officers across multiple states. The investigation was already expanding, but Liza knew it would move with bureaucratic caution, hemmed in by jurisdictional boundaries and legal procedures that gave their enemies time to cover tracks and eliminate witnesses. "There's something else," she said, watching Morrison's tense conversation. "Dr. Vance mentioned that the network serves very important people. That means politicians, judges, law enforcement officials, people who could have access to witness protection details. The implications hung between them like a death sentence. Even federal protection was compromised if the wrong people held the right positions." David was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the flashing lights that represented both salvation and the beginning of a nightmare that might never end. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a resignation that broke her heart. "What do you need me to do?" Liza felt something shift inside her, a fundamental transformation from victim to predator. The frightened woman who'd bought that storage unit was gone, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. Someone who understood that survival meant becoming the thing her enemies feared most. "Help me disappear completely," she said, "and then help me make them pay." The plan unfolded with the precision of a surgical procedure, though Liza knew the irony of that comparison would haunt her later. As dawn broke over the motel parking lot, she and David slipped away from federal protection with the practiced efficiency of ghosts learning to walk through walls. 3 weeks of careful preparation had led to this moment. False identities purchased through David's criminal defense contacts, untraceable phones loaded with encrypted communication apps, a stolen car, David's idea, though the guilt still etched lines around his eyes, with plates that wouldn't trace back to them for at least 48 hours. Most importantly, they had the coordinates. While Agent Morrison's task force had focused on the obvious evidence from the storage unit, Liza had memorized something far more valuable, the pattern hidden within those GPS locations. 15 years of careful documentation had revealed the network's hunting grounds, their operational cycles, their preference for victims who wouldn't be missed by anyone who mattered. now parked outside a rundown clinic in Cleveland's industrial district at 2 a.m., she understood why the federal investigation was moving too slowly. This wasn't just about organ trafficking. It was about the systematic harvesting of society's most vulnerable members, orchestrated by people wealthy enough to buy silence and powerful enough to maintain it. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing the tension that had become her constant companion. 9 months pregnant now, she should have been preparing a nursery, not conducting surveillance on what her research suggested was a procurement facility disguised as a free medical clinic. "Movement," David whispered from the passenger seat, his voice tight with the controlled fear that had replaced his earlier protests about the insanity of their mission. Dr. Vance emerged from the clinic's rear entrance, flanked by 2 men Liza didn't recognize, even in the dim streetlight. His surgical precision was evident in every movement. The careful way he removed his gloves, the methodical inspection of his hands, the professional detachment that suggested tonight had been just another procedure. "He's supposed to be in federal custody," David breathed, his hand instinctively moving to the evidence they'd spent weeks compiling. Morrison said what he believed. Liza felt something cold and final settle in her chest as she watched Dr. Vance climb into a luxury sedan that definitely didn't belong to the federal motor pool. The network's reach goes deeper than any of us imagined. She thought of the phone call she'd intercepted 3 days ago, Morrison's voice discussing case details with someone he'd referred to as Assistant Director Walsh. The same Assistant Director Walsh whose financial records, obtained through channels that would horrify her former social worker self, showed regular deposits from accounts linked to the very medical facilities they were investigating. The corruption wasn't an aberration, it was the system. Dr. Vance's sedan pulled away from the clinic, but Liza didn't follow. She'd learned patience during her months of tracking missing persons, and tonight patience meant waiting for the real prize. The coordinates had led them here, not for Dr. Vance, but for what came next. At 2:47 a.m., a van pulled into the clinic's loading dock. Liza felt her breath catch as she recognized the vehicle, the same model that had appeared at 3 previous sites, always precisely 48 hours after a successful procurement. The cleanup crew, arriving to sanitize evidence and prepare the facility for its next victim. But tonight would be different. Tonight, they were ready. David handed her the modified smartphone they'd spent days programming, its camera linked to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency simultaneously. When this footage went live, it wouldn't matter how many federal officials were compromised. The story would be too public, too widespread to contain. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, though she could see in his eyes that he already knew her answer. Liza thought about the dozens of missing persons files she'd worked over the past 5 years. Homeless veterans whose disappearances were written off as voluntary relocations. Drug addicts whose deaths were attributed to overdoses that never quite made medical sense. Undocumented immigrants who simply vanished from hospital emergency rooms, leaving no trace except her meticulous paperwork. All of them had been harvested like crops, their organs sold to wealthy clients who never questioned the source of their miraculous transplant matches. The van's rear doors opened, and Liza began recording. 3 men emerged, wheeling gurneys that held shapes covered by blood-stained sheets. Even in the grainy footage, the evidence was unmistakable. Fresh victims being transported to whatever facility handled the final stages of the procurement process. "Now," she whispered, and David triggered the upload sequence they'd programmed. Simultaneously, the footage began streaming to every major news network, FBI field office, and social media platform their stolen bandwidth could reach. Within minutes, it would be viral. Within hours, it would be impossible to suppress. The baby kicked once more, harder this time, as if celebrating the moment when her mother stopped running and started fighting back. In the distance, sirens began to wail, but this time, Liza wasn't afraid of what they might bring. The sirens grew louder, but they weren't the cavalry Liza had expected. Through the stolen car's windshield, she watched black SUVs converge on their position with military precision, too fast, too coordinated to be a response to their uploaded footage. "They were tracking us," David said, his voice hollow with the realization that their careful planning had been anticipated from the beginning. The phones, the car, something. Liza's hands moved instinctively to her belly as the first contraction hit, a sharp reminder that her body had reached its own breaking point. 9 months of pregnancy, 3 weeks of running, and now the baby had decided that this moment, surrounded by enemies in a Cleveland parking lot, was the perfect time to make an entrance. "David," she gasped, feeling warm fluid seep through her clothes. "My water just broke." The SUVs had formed a perimeter around them, black-clad figures emerging with the practiced efficiency of a team that had performed this operation many times before. But Liza's attention was split between the approaching threat and the overwhelming realization that labor was beginning whether she was ready or not. Dr. Vance stepped out of the lead vehicle, no longer the composed physician she'd seen in custody. His surgical mask was gone, replaced by the cold smile of someone who held all the cards. Behind him walked a woman in an expensive suit, someone Liza had never seen before but whose authority was immediately apparent. "Mrs. Hartwell," the woman called across the parking lot, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Assistant Director Walsh. We need to talk." The pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. Morrison's boss, the voice from the intercepted phone call, the federal official whose bank records had revealed the network's reach into the highest levels of law enforcement. Another contraction seized Liza, stronger this time, and she gripped David's hand with desperate strength. Through her pain, she saw Walsh approaching with the confident stride of someone who believed she'd already won. "Your footage was impressive," Walsh continued, stopping just outside their car door. "Unfortunately, it documented a federal sting operation. Dr. Vance has been working undercover for months to expose this trafficking network. The bodies you filmed were evidence being transported for forensic analysis. Even in labor, Liza recognized the elegant lies being constructed around them. By morning, the story would be spun into Walsh's heroic narrative, a rogue social worker interfering with a complex federal investigation, her pregnancy-induced paranoia leading to dangerous accusations against dedicated public servants. The best part, Walsh added with clinical appreciation, is that stress-induced labor is a well-documented phenomenon in pregnant women experiencing psychological breaks. When you die in childbirth tonight, it will be a tragic footnote to a cautionary tale about conspiracy theories and mental instability. Dr. Vance stepped forward, medical bag in hand. "Mrs. Hartwell, you're going to need immediate medical attention. Allow me to help with the delivery." The contraction passed, leaving Liza gasping but clear-headed enough to understand the choice being presented to her. Submit to Dr. Vance's medical care and die quietly, her baby delivered alive to disappear into whatever adoption network served the conspiracy's needs, or resist and watch both their deaths become more violent but equally final. David's hand found hers, and she saw in his eyes the same terrible understanding. They'd exposed the network, uploaded the evidence, fought back with everything they had, but it hadn't been enough. "There is a third option," Walsh said, reading their expressions with the skill of someone who'd offered this choice before. "Dr. Vance delivers your baby safely. You both disappear completely. New identities, international relocation, financial support for the rest of your lives. In exchange, you sign affidavits recanting your accusations and confirming the federal sting narrative." Liza felt another contraction building, her body demanding immediate attention regardless of the impossible decision before her. She thought of the missing persons files, the families who would never know what happened to their loved ones, the future victims who would feed this machinery of death. Then she thought of her child, innocent and helpless, whose life hung in the balance of her next words. The uploaded footage she managed between waves of pain. "How do you plan to explain that?" Walsh smiled. "Technical analysis will reveal digital manipulation, crude but convincing deepfakes created by a disturbed woman trying to justify her paranoid delusions. Modern technology makes such fabrications unfortunately common. The baby was coming whether Liza was ready or not, each contraction bringing her closer to a moment when resistance would become impossible. She looked at David, seeing her own agonizing choice reflected in his face. Save their child's life by becoming complicit in the very evil they'd fought to expose, or sacrifice everything for a truth that might die with them. The decision tore through her like another contraction, more painful than the physical labor consuming her body. But as she met Walsh's expectant gaze, Liza knew there was only one choice her conscience would allow her to live with, even if she didn't live long to regret it. "No," Liza said through gritted teeth, another contraction building as she made the choice that would damn them all. "Go to hell." Walsh's smile never wavered. "Dr. Vance, please proceed with emergency delivery procedures." The next few minutes blurred together in a haze of pain and gunfire. David's service weapon, the one detail their captors had somehow missed, appeared in his hand as he threw himself across Liza's body. The parking lot erupted in muzzle flashes and shouting voices, but Liza's world had narrowed to the overwhelming urge to push. Through the chaos, she heard David screaming into his phone, not to the compromised federal agents, but to the one contact they'd held in reserve. Detective Sarah Chen from Detroit PD, the only investigator whose financial records had come back clean, whose missing persons cases showed the same suspicious patterns Liza had identified. The baby was crowning now, nature's imperative overriding everything else. Liza bore down with primal intensity, her body completing its ancient purpose even as bullets shattered the car windows around them. She felt the child slip free with a rush of fluid and relief, heard the first outraged cry that meant life, meant survival, meant everything they'd fought for had meaning. David's return fire had driven Walsh's team back, but Liza could see more vehicles approaching. In moments, they'd be overwhelmed. She cradled her newborn daughter. A daughter, she realized with fierce joy, against her chest, using her own body as a shield against the violence surrounding them. "Chen's calling in every favor she's got," David shouted over the gunfire. "Real federal agents, state police, local media, she's burning every bridge to get here in time." Time was running out. Dr. Vance had taken cover behind an SUV, coordinating with Walsh to tighten the perimeter. In minutes, maybe seconds, they'd rush the car and finish what they'd started. Liza's daughter would become another victim of the network's insatiable appetite. Then she heard the most beautiful sound of her life, competing sirens approaching from multiple directions. Not the coordinated response of Walsh's corrupted team, but the chaotic convergence of legitimate law enforcement, media helicopters, and emergency vehicles that meant Chen had succeeded in making this too public to suppress. Walsh's expression shifted from confidence to calculation as she assessed the changing situation. Through the growing cacophony of approaching vehicles, Liza heard her speaking rapidly into a radio, coordinating what sounded like an immediate retreat. "This isn't over," Walsh called across the parking lot as her team began falling back to their vehicles. "That child will never be safe. Every hospital, every school, every government database will find you eventually." Dr. Vance was the last to retreat, his medical bag abandoned as he climbed into the lead SUV, but his final look toward Liza carried a promise of unfinished business, the patient persistence of someone accustomed to claiming what he wanted regardless of obstacles. The black vehicles disappeared into the Cleveland night just as the first legitimate police cruiser arrived, followed by Detective Chen's unmarked sedan and what looked like half the federal agents in Ohio. Agent Morrison emerged from one of the cars, his face grim with the knowledge that his own agency had been compromised at the highest levels. "We got Walsh's communications," Morrison said, as paramedics swarmed around Liza and her newborn daughter. "Full recordings of her coordination with the trafficking network. Assistant Director Walsh is about to become the Bureau's most wanted fugitive." Liza nodded weakly, exhaustion finally claiming her as adrenaline faded. Her daughter lay quiet against her chest, tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb with surprising strength. They'd survived the night, but Walsh's words echoed in her mind. This wasn't over. As the ambulance carried them toward a hospital that Detective Chen had personally vetted, Liza looked down at her daughter's peaceful face and made another choice. They'd exposed the network, scattered its leadership, and handed federal investigators enough evidence to dismantle the trafficking operation. But justice would require more than courtroom victories. The missing persons files were still out there, families still waiting for answers about loved ones who'd been harvested like commodities. Walsh and Dr. Vance were in the wind, but they'd surface eventually, probably rebuilding their operation in another city, another state. "What are you thinking?" David asked, reading the expression on her face with the accuracy of someone who'd learned to fear her moments of quiet determination. Liza smiled, feeling her daughter's steady heartbeat against her chest. "I'm thinking our girl is going to grow up in a world where monsters like Walsh don't get to hide in the shadows." She'd started this journey as a desperate woman trying to pay bills. She was ending it as something far more dangerous, a mother with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The war was just beginning. The return. 6 months later, Liza stood in the doorway of her new apartment, watching Grace sleep in the crib that David had assembled 3 times before getting it right. The morning light filtered through bulletproof glass, a precaution that had become as routine as checking the locks or scanning the street before leaving the building. The woman who'd bought that storage unit in desperation no longer existed. In her place stood someone harder, more watchful, shaped by months of running and fighting and learning that the world held darker truths than she'd ever imagined as a social worker. The naive faith in institutions that had once defined her had been burned away, replaced by the careful vigilance of someone who'd seen how easily corruption could masquerade as justice. Grace stirred, making the soft sounds that meant she'd wake soon. At 6 months old, she had David's stubborn chin and Liza's determined eyes, a combination that suggested she'd inherited the worst possible traits for a quiet life. But watching her daughter stretch tiny fists toward the sunlight, Liza felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. The apartment door opened behind her, and she didn't flinch. 3 months ago, any unexpected sound would have sent her diving for cover. Now she recognized David's footsteps, the particular way he favored his left leg since taking shrapnel in Cleveland, the careful quiet he maintained around Grace's nap time. "Morrison called," he said, settling beside her with the morning coffee that had become their ritual. "They found another facility." Liza accepted the mug without taking her eyes off Grace. "Where?" "Phoenix. Same setup, medical clinic in a low-income area, missing persons reports that don't get proper investigation. Local FBI thinks it's connected to Walsh's network." The old Liza would have felt helpless rage at the news, knowing victims were dying while bureaucrats debated jurisdiction and evidence requirements. The new Liza simply nodded, already planning. Morrison had become an unlikely ally after Walsh's betrayal, sharing information that officially couldn't be shared, coordinating with the growing network of law enforcement officers who'd discovered the conspiracy's reach into their own departments. "Chen's flying out tomorrow," David continued. "She wants to know if you're interested in consulting." Detective Chen had become more than an ally. She'd become the sister Liza had never had, bound together by the shared knowledge of how close they'd come to losing everything. The consulting work was technically freelance victim advocacy, helping families navigate the bureaucracy of missing persons cases. In reality, it was intelligence gathering, tracking patterns that might reveal other harvesting operations before they could claim more victims. Grace opened her eyes, focusing on Liza with the intense concentration that babies brought to everything. 6 months old, and already she seemed to understand that her world was different from other children's, that strangers were studied before being trusted, that certain conversations stopped when she entered the room, that her mother's vigilance never completely relaxed. "What do you think, baby girl?" Liza murmured, lifting Grace from the crib. "Ready for another road trip?" David smiled, but she caught the worry in his expression. They'd been moving constantly since Cleveland, never staying anywhere long enough to establish patterns that Walsh's remaining contacts might exploit. It was no life for a child, this constant vigilance, this assumption that danger lurked behind every normal interaction. But it was the life Grace had inherited, and Liza had made peace with that reality. Her daughter would grow up understanding that evil often wore respectable faces, that institutions could be corrupted, that justice sometimes required breaking rules that protected the guilty more than the innocent. The doorbell rang, 2 short bursts followed by 3 long ones. Chen's signal. Detective Chen looked older than her 42 years, worn down by months of fighting battles within her own department, as the investigation revealed how deeply the corruption had spread. But her eyes still held the fierce determination that had made her risk everything to answer David's desperate call that night in Cleveland. Phoenix PD found 17 bodies, Chen said without preamble, settling at their kitchen table with the weary efficiency of someone who'd delivered too much bad news. All matching the harvesting patterns, Walsh's signature methodology, but the surgical precision suggests Dr. Vance is still involved. Liza bounced Grace gently, feeling that familiar cold anger settle in her chest. 17 more victims, 17 families who'd been living with false hope while their loved ones were reduced to profitable commodities. The clinic's been operating for 8 months, Chen continued. Long enough to establish trust in the community, build relationships with vulnerable populations, homeless veterans, undocumented immigrants, drug addicts, people whose disappearances wouldn't generate much investigation. The same pattern they'd seen in Detroit, Cleveland, and 3 other cities where Walsh's network had operated, always targeting the marginalized, the forgotten, the people whose deaths could be explained away as unfortunate but predictable consequences of difficult lives. Grace grabbed Liza's finger with surprising strength, tiny nails digging into skin as if sensing the tension in the room. Looking down at her daughter's trusting face, Liza made another choice, the same choice she'd been making every day since Cleveland. "When do we leave?" she asked. The war was just beginning, but now she had something worth fighting for, the new beginning. 2 years later, Liza stood in the sunlit courtyard of the Phoenix Federal Courthouse, watching Grace take tentative steps between the memorial benches dedicated to trafficking victims. At 2.5, her daughter moved with the fearless determination of someone who'd never known a world where monsters couldn't be defeated. The trial had lasted 8 months. Assistant Director Walsh, Dr. Marcus Vance, and 14 other CO conspirators faced life sentences for their roles in what prosecutors called the most extensive organ trafficking network in U.S. history. The evidence Liza had gathered from that storage unit, combined with the intelligence work she, David, and Detective Chen had conducted across 6 states, had dismantled an operation that spanned 15 years and claimed over 200 lives. "Mama, flower," Grace announced, toddling toward a memorial garden where families had planted roses for victims who would never come home. Liza followed, her hand instinctively checking the concealed carry permit she'd never expected to need as a social worker. Some habits died hard even now that the immediate danger had passed. Chen emerged from the courthouse behind them, her detective shield replaced by the federal marshal's badge she'd earned after her work on the case. "Sentencing came down," Chen said, settling beside Liza on a bench inscribed with names of the forgotten dead. Walsh got life without parole, Vance too. The judge called it systematic predation on society's most vulnerable members. Liza nodded, watching Grace examine a ladybug with scientific intensity. Justice felt quieter than she'd expected, not the triumphant vindication she'd imagined, but a simple recognition that the machinery of law had finally worked as intended. The families who'd testified during the trial would have their answers now, closure purchased with years of investigation and courage. "Morrison wants to know if you'll consider the permanent position," Chen continued. "Federal victim advocate, specializing in trafficking cases, full benefits, security clearance, the works." The offer had been on the table for months, a chance to transform her vigilante investigation work into legitimate federal employment. It meant stability for Grace, resources to help other families, the institutional support she'd always believed could make a difference. It also meant accepting that this was who she'd become, someone who understood darkness intimately enough to fight it professionally. David appeared in the courthouse doorway, his testimony finally complete after 3 days of detailing the network's financial structure. The accountant who'd married a social worker had evolved into something harder, a forensic specialist who could trace money through the most sophisticated laundering schemes. The experience had changed them both, burned away illusions about how justice worked in practice rather than theory. Grace found a friend, David observed, settling beside them as their daughter attempted to coax the ladybug onto her finger. Liza smiled, remembering the terrified woman who'd bid on storage units with her last $300. That person felt like someone she'd read about rather than lived as, distant enough to seem fictional, close enough to remind her how completely circumstances could reshape a life. The ladybug obliged Grace's gentle persistence, crawling onto her outstretched palm. Her daughter's delighted giggle carried across the courtyard, drawing smiles from other families who'd come to witness the trial's conclusion. Some were survivors, others were relatives of victims, all bound together by the shared understanding of how close they'd come to losing everything to institutional failure. "I'll take the position," Liza said quietly. "But I want Chen as my partner, and I want authority to coordinate with local law enforcement in cases involving missing persons from vulnerable populations." Chen raised an eyebrow. "Trying to build your own department? Trying to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Grace toddled back to them, ladybug cupped carefully in her palms. "Mom, our bug needs home." "That's right, baby. Everyone needs a safe home." Liza lifted her daughter, settling her on the bench between herself and David. Around them, the courthouse courtyard buzzed with the quiet conversations of people processing the end of a long nightmare. Families embraced, lawyers packed their briefcases, reporters filed their final stories about the case that had exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. But for Liza, the ending felt more like a beginning. She'd discovered capabilities she'd never suspected, found strength in the darkest possible circumstances, learned that ordinary people could choose to become extraordinary when the stakes demanded it. Grace released the ladybug, watching it fly toward the memorial garden where roses bloomed in memory of the lost. Her daughter would grow up in a world where Liza's vigilance had meaning, where the networks that preyed on the vulnerable faced systematic opposition rather than bureaucratic indifference. The war wasn't over, it never would be. But now she had allies, resources, and most importantly, a reason to believe that individual choices could reshape institutional failures. Grace leaned against her shoulder, sleepy from the excitement of courthouse adventures and ladybug discoveries. Looking down at her daughter's peaceful face, Liza felt the bone-deep satisfaction of someone who'd found their true calling in the most unlikely circumstances. She'd started this journey desperate and alone. She was ending it dangerous and determined, exactly what the world needed.